my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel. A vast majority of spiritual wellness practices that currently exist in status quo are products of certain indigenous cultures or other cultures that exist within status quo. We think the biggest problem here is that corporations now are using these specific cultures that belongs to individuals and is deep rooted into them as a means to profit off it. And therefore, we think that this is problematic and this needs to come to a stop. Now, what is commercialization? I have a few characterizations. Number 1, it's oftentimes a tool used by corporations to expand the market, to expand themselves in order to be profit incentive, in order to earn a profit from it at the expense of the cost of the individual cultures. Secondly, it's oftentimes when you want to commercialize things, there are things like marketing, which needs to sensationalize the products in order to reach a larger outreach of people. Therefore, this sort of mass marketing creates a misrepresentation of the treatments that were created by these sort of cultures and indigenous communities, and also creates a lot of predatory marketing, such as preying on the most vulnerable individuals and insecurities of them in order to force them to buy more of their products constantly. Thirdly, it's oftentimes plagiarized. This is to say that there are oftentimes predatory contracts that forces individuals to sell out their cultures in order to profit off from it. So corporations can profit off from it, but oftentimes corporations do not handle them a single penny despite earning a profit. Thus, we need a comparative here is that a world with commercialization on side of opposition leads to an increase of corporations actively seeking out for rituals and treatments from indigenous communities or even other cultures because it became a potential field of market that individuals think that they can profit from. Thus, we think a world without commercialization on the side of government leads to 2 things. Number 1, there's no longer a mass produced and mass advertisation of this sort of spiritual wellness treatments. Therefore, there's going to be a decrease of corporations actively going out and seeking to find new cultures and seeking to exploit indigenous cultures for their things. And secondly, it's just going to be there's going to be a decrease of advertisements that are predatory in nature and preys on the most vulnerable individuals and their insecurities. Thus, the burden of this debate on side of government is simple. It's just why we regret the commercialization and why the world would be a better place without it. Now, moving on to my principal arguments. As already characterized from the start of this debate, the vast majority of instances, these sort of wellness practices are oftentimes things derived from certain cultures and used for the mass majority of consumers within the market, like the white corporations stealing some indigenous practices in order to profit off from it. But oftentimes, these sort of cultures are something that are deep rooted into them. These sort of indigenous people use it as a form of identity. This is to say that they have literally ancestors that are willing to sacrifice themselves in order to preserve these cultures. They are literally using these cultures as a means to cleanse themselves, as a very spiritual means of being a better person within their culture. We think corporations from the start of this debate has no right to barge into other individual cultures and culturally appropriate all these sort of things. Now, opposition might come out here and say that, oh, but these are things consented. We don't think that this is true because vast majority of instances, these are things that are indigenous peoples are oftentimes forced into very predatory contracts that force them to sign things without their consent to sell these sort of cultures that they didn't know that they didn't consent to things that they weren't sure what the contract really means. Therefore, we think that this is just harmful. Now, the impacts here is number 1, we think this is a direct assault to their dignity, identity as a whole. Once you mass commercialize it and it becomes something that's just common in the market, we think this sort of thing just their ancestors has so much effort to preserve has lost.
Hello? I think you're cutting up for us on our end.
I think I missed.
It might be better if you refresh your connection.
Is that
You'll pause time.
Yeah, moving. And secondly, we know what this song means. What?
Yeah, I think it's still going on.
My speech in 3. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Thus, meeting the impacts of this debate is that a world without mass commercialization is a world that doesn't have a direct assault towards the dignity and identity of the most vulnerable people on the ground. And secondly, it's not a world with false advertisement that creates a false impression within the indigenous communities and their cultures to begin with. The comparative here is that a world without mass commercialization is just significantly better for the most vulnerable people on the ground because you do not have market preying into the most vulnerable communities just to earn a profit from it and just to seek for better treatment so that they can sell to the general population who doesn't understand their culture and who doesn't care about it. Now I'm just going on to another scenario. So even if the sort of like wellness, like opposition wants to bring out the fact that sort of wellness spiritual treatments are not specifically from indigenous communities, why is that still bad for the general consumers that exist within the market? Because number one, predatory marketing exists. This is to say, predatory marketing often preys on the most insecurities of individuals. They prey on the most vulnerable. This is to say, like they oftentimes have false advertisement to say that like, oh, you are depressed and like you need help. These sort of things that preys on individuals and forces them to feel insecure of themselves and forces them to buy these sort of products in order to feel better for themselves. We think the problem with that is just number one, individuals who are just cannot generally feel happy of themselves because they were originally fine, but because of this mass marketed that preyed on their insecurities, they are now just like they're just now like forcibly going to buy these kind of products in order to feel better about themselves. And secondly, we think this is so problematic because all this kind of like spiritual well-being are something that's just a mindset and like you can never generally feel happy yourself. You can never, feel enough. Therefore, this is even if you like buy a product, you're going to constantly keep buying until you feel satisfied with yourself. But that's not going to be true because you can never feel satisfied about yourself to begin. Thus, we think the comparative here is just a world without this sort of mass advertisement. It's a world where individuals can just stop feeling like bad about themselves just because they do not have access to this sort of like spiritual wellness treatments or because they cannot afford these kind of treatments to begin with. We think this is just a way comparatively better world when this sort of mass advertisement doesn't access. The second thing here is that because of the mass commercialization that exists within this school, the mass advertisement that like constantly says like, oh, this is like the roots to your problems. This is the way to solve your problem. Reading what this creates, it's just it creates it preys on the vulnerabilities, not just on the most like common individuals, but also on like the most specific individuals like parents. This is to say that oftentimes there are like conservative parents or parents who are just like very insecure of themselves. They oftentimes buy this sort of product in hopes like and feed it to their children in hopes that like it solves all their issues. It becomes a thing where like parents would not no longer resort to things like scientific medicines or like scientific things because of the fact that they realize that like, oh, all I need to do is just buy this very cheap product that is easily accessible for me and it could potentially solve all the problems that my child is facing, but that is not, it's only like it solves wellness treatments and it doesn't really solve the core issues that the kids might be facing in the long term. Thus, we think the reason why like this is just significantly better in the long run is because without this sort of mass commercialization, there'll be lesser people falling into prey for all these sort of products that yes, it is good to them, but we think the problem is in this code is a mass commercialization that forces them to buy more, to consume more that they don't need, because the corporations want to earn a profit from it. Therefore, we think the reason why we think that this kind of things will still access the status quo. It's like people can still actively seek out for different measures in order to feel better about themselves. But the only difference here is just that like people are not affected by this sort of false advertisements. And secondly, it's just that your most vulnerable communities like the indigenous communities wouldn't have their cultures taken away because like white people corporations want to just feel better and want to profit off of them. I think that was it because like I cut off around 3:40. Thus now we propose. Thank you.
Thank you for the wonderful speech. Now proceed with the opposition case. First opposition speaker. Here.
Hi, can I check that I am audible?
You are.
All right, thank you. Okay. All right. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. All right. So what has government come up here and told us today? Okay, firstly, they told us that corporations are stealing indigenous culture. Secondly, they told us that advertising trades on the insecurities of the individuals. And lastly, there's some point about things like anti-vaxxers and there's people who would completely wholeheartedly believe that these things can cure all of your ailments. All right, just going to be repeating this one by one. Firstly, about how corporations are stealing indigenous culture. We see that this is not true insofar as spiritual wellness practices don't have huge profit margins. There are little to no big corporations who sell these practices. Inside government gives no examples to substantiate these claims. We tell you that this commercialization is that looks at things like small businesses and individual owners. Additionally, the nature of such practices is that they cannot be mass produced. You cannot mass produce crystals or nature walks or yoga lessons. So there is little incentive for corporations to actually start creating yoga classes insofar as these things these kinds of practices have incredibly low profit margins. Even if this does happen, recognize that spiritual wellness practices are oftentimes different from other mass-produced items and services insofar as selling these services oftentimes comes with a prerequisite of knowing a lot about such cultures, something unique to the minorities that sell these services and not the corporations. Additionally, corporations are unlikely to steal these practices and benefit from them substantially because of the innate nature of these practices is that there is a certain extent of intimacy and personalization. This looks like personalized consultations for a ritual program and readings. This is not something that can be mass-produced and emulated by corporations. Hence, we see that even if corporations suddenly want to chuck crystals on their shelves, it's not going to be very successful with consumers who actually care about the authenticity of these practices. Secondly, about false advertising and it preying on the insecurities of individuals. Recognize that this exists for literally all forms of advertising and recognize that unless SciGov is regretting all forms of advertising, then they just do not solve the issue of advertising generally capitalizing on the idea that people need more things in their lives. And also, if you're really worried about false advertising, there's not an issue with your healing crystals. This is an issue with the lack of advertising laws in a nation. Even if this calls out individuals for emotional issues like them feeling sad and angry, recognize that accessing spiritual wellness programs is oftentimes the gateway to accessing broader mental health services and communities that legitimately care about mental and physical wellness alike. I'll be elaborating about that in myself. Lastly, about just people who believe that crystals will just solve all of their issues. Recognize this is not true. Spiritual wellness programs are not marketed as scientific or claiming to solve COVID or ailments. Recognize that they are marketed as programs that you can take to feel some mental clarity, not solve all of your issues. Psych government simply has a fundamental misunderstanding with what the motion entails. It's not about pseudoscience or alternative medicine. It's literally about spiritual wellness, not science. Even if this has happened, recognize that this is easily countered with governments enacting good health education about science and how to treat illnesses, which we believe should be enacted anyway and is enacted in most developed nations. So the existence of spiritual wellness programs has greater benefits beyond inspiring anti-vaxxers. Furthermore, realize that accessing these programs is the first step towards getting more help, and I'll be talking about that in my talk later. All right. Really quick clarification for the house today. In order for there to be any sort of normalization and these practices becoming mainstream, you need commercialization. Recognize that people who practice these are oftentimes originally part of indigenous cultures or like these are minority pagan cultures, so they have no incentive to actually spread it without commercialization. However, on our side, we actually show that we have more that this just spreads a lot more, which just generally helps people benefit in them partaking in the activities. All right. Two slides for the house today about how we make it about how on our side these practices are accessible for people to partake in activities that they can benefit from, and secondly about how the providers of these services can continue sustaining their business. Firstly, about how it's more accessible. Recognize that as a retrospective debate, we must first need to analyze what this commercialization looks like. What has happened in the past is that when you commercialize spirituality more, people have attempted to market it by framing this in a way that is genuinely appealing. This is like crystals becoming a larger trend in female fashion, such as the general pastel aesthetic, bringing awareness. This commercialization and increased marketing makes it something that enters the mainstream sphere. It becomes more accessible insofar as you literally have more people offering it in these communities that branch out near urban places where more people live. And why is this so important? Recognize that many people feel like they have less and less control over their lives and emotions in an increasingly stressful world. So they yearn for autonomy over their lives. So what can spiritual wellness do? It can step in to actually give people a feeling of control. For instance, meditation can and has been proven to be able to reap tangible, medically proven benefits such as increased mental clarity and better psychological health in general. You also have other things like healing crystals, which do not necessarily reap any practical or medically proven benefit, but they can still serve to benefit consumers at the point in which the presence of a crystal in their bedroom or something makes them feel at peace, or when they believe that the crystals in their bed of different types specifically are good omens. Although this may simply be a case of placebo effect, we do not see why it is necessarily a bad thing, because as long as something gives people a peace of mind and places them at the point in the point in which it allows them to feel like they have some semblance of control over their lives, and when it feels like everything else is just going, it's just being terrible, we don't see why there is a need to rip these people of their status and remove a coping mechanism for those who direly need it. No, thank you. The rise and commercialization of these spiritual wellness practices is also a part of the largest rise in society's prioritization of health, of self-care. And in fact, one of the leading advocates for it, and we don't see why this is a bad thing. Insofar as the modern person has to cope with so many stresses, they deserve to take care of themselves and their own mental health. However, recognize that for a long time, mental health has been neglected, and anyone who needs that, who wants to take their special attention towards their mental state has generally been seen as a lunatic. For so long as people have neglected the importance of self-care in a dog-eat dog world, we see that the normalization of spiritual wellness practices is not a mainstream trend, it's merely a step further in the right direction to further affirm that society does recognize self-care as a legitimate and important endeavor, and hence allowing these businesses to provide easier access to those who need it. In addition, by allowing providers of these services to step into the market and easily sell their practices, it promotes the notion that self-care is something that is important and legitimate. And we think this is an important thing for society as a whole because it legitimizes self-care as a pursuit that is feasible and important. We also think that this greater accessibility of spiritual welfare practices is oftentimes a gateway to broader mental health wellness services. Recognize that going to therapy, as mentioned, already has a huge stigma against it. This is something seen as incredibly heavy, incredibly serious, so people may feel intimidated going into it, insofar as you feel like you have to have something wrong with you if you're going for it, that you're mentally ill. When you get more of these services, we see that this is a way for people to care about their mental health in a way that is not seen as something as serious and heavy, which is important in them having the courage to actually take the first step forward. Why is this good? We think that this is literally just you taking steps to help your mental health, especially in societies with stigma. This is especially important as people with mental health issues are already very insecure about them. You also join a community that actually cares about your mental health, that you can tell your issues to. But it's good in terms of finding common communities and learning about mental health. You're just empowering yourselves, and for sometimes they can actually encourage you to go take further steps, to go to therapy if the situation is really that bad. So what's the impact? When you normalize these practices, you bring more awareness to it. It just means once again you get more businesses popping up, you have more people who are able to gain access to it. When these practices actually bring awareness to mental health, insofar as they explicitly point out the gaps in today's concrete jungle and how we need to look after our spiritual health, and these practices become mainstream, it just means that you oftentimes as a society care more about spiritual and mental health. So this looks like demolishing the stigma against mental health and people going to more of these services. Once it also these services just look more legit, and as a society, you just in general get better mental health. Because of this incredibly large benefit for towards everyone in today's society, I am so proud to oppose. Thank you.
Thank you for that wonderful speech. Now to continue the case of proposition, second proposition speaker. Here.
All right. Can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you.
Okay. You guys can ask POIs in the chat. Starting in 3, 2, 1. So opposition says spiritual wellness good. The debate was not about whether spiritual wellness was good or bad. So all the benefits the opposition claims are uncontentious and it cannot win on that alone. The problem we proposed was the commercialization has actively bastardized and degraded the foundational intrinsic value of these spiritual wellness practices. So even if their side ensures there's perfect access to this, we would just contend it's untrue. They still aren't able to claim all the benefits of you being able to have perfect mental health because that's not a problem they can solve under their side. But I just want to be really clear about what the counterfactual is likely to be. We don't think people will stop taking taking care of their mental health, we don't think people are going to completely ignore all the mental health issues in the first place. And the analysis for this is very simple, because in order for spiritual wellness as a business to spring up in the first place, this suggests that there was already people who wanted to opt in towards this in the first place, which means that people probably already care, because if they do not care about their mental health, they wouldn't go towards these products in the first place. So why is it then better under our side? I think there'll be some reasonable degree of access, because the commercialization itself is not what makes you care about spiritual wellness and mental health, because people already understand this is important for all the reasons they suggest that it is. There's probably things like education, there's probably things like access to information. So that is the model that we're probably going to support. We think people are able to find meaning through different ways as well. So therefore, what their side has to show is, why was it better for us to predicate the only way for you to ensure that you have better mental health was to predatory spiritual wellness experiences that were likely to lock out the most vulnerable and lead to many negative externalities about indigenous communities that was conveniently ignored by the opposition then. So what was the model they actually proved to why it was going to be good? So they say it's things like small businesses being able to do this, which means that access to this is democratized and there's not lots of predatory practices. Firstly, this is not true, because as a small business, you probably can't do things like being able to like advertise healing crystals or have things like meditation retreats, because this oftentimes requires a huge degree of startup initial capital that you're likely to lose access to on the opposition. So if they want to say that this is small businesses, they lose access to a huge benefit of that commercialization. So the debate becomes quite marginal. So therefore, you have to weigh up our side more. But number two, we give you reasons as to why it probably isn't going to be small businesses that are in control of this industry, because even for things like advertising healing crystals, you probably do have to have like a corporation producing this to a large extent, or even if it's small businesses producing these things, means that you aren't able to have access to economics of scale. So it's probably going to be quite expensive. So even if their side means to sell this, so it's quite bad. So on either side, it's likely to be quite harmful for access towards these things. So that's just not the model we see in status quo, because this is an actively retrospective debate. Three things in this speech then. The first I want to talk about is why problematic marketing by companies is likely to have many people lose access towards this. And it's going to be quite bad, and it's directly contends with their side as well. So we have seen predatory ways in which companies market their wellness products. The reality is that this demand is artificially created and sustained by this industry, and it's never a choice that people could freely make. They're more likely to be true they were coerced into this decision to choose these specific wellness products. So this means that like it's likely quite harmful for them, because they cannot get full information and consent as to when they're actually opting into these things. But the second layer is predatory marketing often uses very emotional sentiments. So this looks at the artificial promise of being able to solve all your mental challenges. You can alleviate all your mental suffering if you use these healing crystals. But it oftentimes looks like others like sentiments and biases that you have. Like for example, the fear of missing out means you want to opt in towards these things, even if it's not going to be really good for you. But thirdly, oftentimes co-opt social sentiments. So things like co-opting feminist narratives, like this is like beauty is what you define it to be, or like other things that may necessarily feel like this is the best way in order you feel empowered as a woman, which is that many people end up feeling that this is an important part to accessing their true identities, and many people are coerced into this, and they feel like they're dependent upon these spiritual wellness products, which means you lock people in. Thirdly, they say it's a gateway to accessing other mental services, which I would like to point out is entirely asserted as a one-liner. As we proved earlier, people already do care about mental health, which is why they want to opt in towards these products in the first place. I would say that corporations have an incentive to lock you in, so you continue to buy their products and they continue to make profits. So they artificially put you on a hedonistic treadmill, for example, activating dopamine within your brain when you experience these forms of spiritual wellness. And it's not true that businesses have an incentive to lower prices. Why do they have incentive to charge high prices and make this exclusionary? 4 reasons. Number one, because of brand loyalty, means that Victoria's Secret at whatever price can sell this perfume and you're still going to have people buying it. But number two, since the marketing is predatory, they artificially create highly inelastic demand by making you believe you need this product, you need this nature ritual, you need this strawberry bath bomb. So this is just the same way that people buy cigarettes even if it's a really high price, because you feel like you need it, otherwise you'll be decimated. But thirdly, it's a continuous subscription. It's not a one-off purchase. So once you have a meditation retreat, the retreat will end after 2 days. If you buy a strawberry scented candle, after a few hours, the candle will burn out. So you're forced to keep going back. But fourthly, if the market segment is catered towards wealthier groups, they don't have to cater towards other groups in the first place, because they're already making enough money out of that. These are 4 structural nuanced mechanisms specifically about spiritual wellness as to why it's likely to be highly exclusionary and many people don't have access towards this. Their analysis was regulation and changing the advertising industry. Number one, most of these companies are really big. those that create self-care products often already engage in other types of industries, have already steady streams of revenue. So for example, if you're Victoria's Secret, you can sell your lingerie or you can sell your lotion, which means that you have the ability to dodge all these forms of accountability. But number two, if you use sugar-coated expressions, they cannot be identified and weeded out because people believe it's good for them even if it's harmful. Thirdly, even if you give disclaimers, it oftentimes appears in small print text. So it's hard for consumers to actually pick up on these things as well as algorithms as well. So this oftentimes means that regulation isn't going to work and these predatory practices are going to continue as you allow these companies to compound on profits over time. Second argument here about access. Access to self-care products is likely to be quite bad because opposition is unlikely to get these self-care products to the people that need it the most, because it's always the people, as it's likely to be people who are struggling with mental health. It's probably not going to be the richest segment in society already. So it means many people lose access towards this. It's a trade-off they have to make. So even on the worst case on both sides, some people will lack access to it, because in the worst case of our side, we're willing to be charitable and concede. We can't have perfect access. We can't create the same degree of all these things on opposition. But why then do we still win, and how do you resolve this clash? So the first thing to say here is that access is not an inherent good. If you get access to these wellness experiences, but you reduce the very value of it, then they don't get to claim the benefit of that. Because if it means that, like, you just firstly lead to all the negative externalities, for example, just bastardizing indigenous communities, oftentimes like just extracting like all the human dignity and the generic argument, but it's just quite true as well. But thirdly, just oftentimes they lose access towards them being able to use their own culture, because now someone co-opts their culture for their own commercialization. So many people lose access towards this. Even if we have to defend that these indigenous practices stay within indigenous groups, we're happy to defend that because those people are the ones that are willing to get most benefit out of that. Also, there's alternatives that we already have. So I'm not sure why that's inherent good. So third here about why we're able to better extract meaningful spiritual wellness, because many people feel bad about this. So for example, the predatory marketing practices that we characterized you earlier means that some spiritual products are going to be better than others. So I'm going to say my strawberry candle is better than blueberry candle from company X. So this means that many people are less likely to get access towards the top tier products. And because the top tier companies have more money to market their top tier products, means that every time you feel that you're entering towards spiritual wellness, you feel bad because you feel like you're not getting access to the optimal thing in the first place. The reason why this is harmful is because spiritual wellness is a mental concept, which means that if you feel bad and you feel like you're not getting access towards the best in the industry, means that you just don't be being able to have the best like mental capacity, because you always feel like you're losing out on something else, and then because you're made to feel bad about it because you don't get access to the best things in the industry. So even on their side, even if you have being able to have market segmentation towards the poor still aren't able to get the best access towards this because other narratives in society coerce you into believing that you're not having enough. The counterfactual under our side is we don't have to say strawberry candle is objectively better than blueberry candle, that nature retreat is objectively better than you having a conversation with your family. All of these things should be treated as spiritual wellness. It's not the most expensive, the most beautiful, the most wealthy experiences that actually solve your mental health problems. It's people being able to individualize this for themselves and not having a company dictate about whether you should have a good day tomorrow or not. For all these reasons, we are proud to propose.
Thank you for that wonderful speech. Now to continue the case of opposition, second opposition speaker. Here.
Hello, am I audible?
Yep, you are.
All right, give me a second to set up my timer. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I'd like to start off with some responses, and then I will move on to my substantives proper. Firstly, about what DBM has raised, saying that it's not a debate about whether spiritual wellness is good or bad. Yes, we understand this. What we were trying to prove with our first substantive, if you were listening, is that the commercialization and easier access of these practices is good simply because it can benefit a lot of people. Secondly, they say that the people who are commercializing this are corporations and not SMEs. We have literally talked to you about many reasons why it's likely to be small and medium enterprises, but the best response to this is that it is a retrospective debate. We can tell you about communities of Native Americans providing ritual consultations. Literally, people on Carousel can sell crystals, and they provide no
like good example of what like corporations they have on their side. So if you can tell me about a crystal selling corporation, a yoga corporation, a nature ritual corporation in status quo, I would love to hear it. But since you obviously don't get the idea that this is a retrospective debate, I don't see how you win on your characterization that is like big corporations who are doing this. Recognize that insofar as DPM can never give us any examples besides literal, Victoria's Secret, Lush, and Yankee Candle, which are not the spiritual wellness services we are talking about in today's debate. Clearly not. Like, so I will be the person who is going to recharacterize debate into something that is actually fitting to the motion. Thirdly, they tell us that access to spiritual wellness services will be bad. We give you structural reasons why access is better on our side. Firstly, it becomes popularized. Competition is greater and prices can be kept low, especially considering that the market for spiritual wellness services is extremely diverse. For example, tarot card readers that claim that they can read different things. And secondly, recognize that the marketing of spiritual wellness services are extremely personalized. There's no such thing as the best objective spiritual wellness practice. It's about what gels with you as a person, what you think you need the most to like help your like current struggles and who you are as a person today. Onto my self-centered proper. Firstly, how these providers of these services can continue sustaining their businesses and why it is important. We tell you that what's likely to happen is that minorities are going to be the one who are going to be benefiting off of their culture and profiting off of it in the form of providing spiritual wellness programs. What's the context? Spiritual wellness practices oftentimes come from cultural and religious minorities whose practices have not currently penetrated mainstream culture or are not part of other ritualistic practices. Previously, before this commercialization, they have been generally discredited due to their culture. It looks like Christianity and most mainstream organized religion condemning paganism. And the commercialization of these practices have provided minorities with more avenues to earn income in a world where minorities are already mocked and shamed for their culture, unable to benefit from it, and are furthermore systemically locked out of positions in the corporate world where they can earn stable incomes. Recognize that the most successful producers of spiritual wellness programs are likely to be the minorities and people that these practices actually resonate the most with. For instance, pagans are most likely to be crystal sellers. It's just like how you would most likely prefer to eat Chinese food cooked by a Chinese person. Recognize that minorities are most likely able to leverage the idea of legitimacy since they have grown up with the state's spiritual practice and are well educated on how it works, especially as many of these spiritual wellness practices are embroiled in religion and culture, which requires a large amount of knowledge about the culture to explain it to other people and to engage in these practices. It is more likely that services provided will be originating from the same culture, will be seen by consumers as most legitimate. And that is why we feel that the population of people who are going to be providing these services are most likely going to be people who originate from the culture itself. Consumers would care about the legitimacy of said practices insofar as the consumers are individuals that are A, forking out money for practices, and B, invested in seriously improving their lives via said practices. Therefore, patronizing minority services at a higher rate than other service providers. So what's the impact of this? What happens then is that you allow minorities to profit off of their own culture and make a living out of sharing practices that they are passionate about and that they are competent at. Realize that this is perfectly possible in today's digital age. It takes little to no startup cost to create an online shop with a free website from Wix, etc., and free promotion via your own social media accounts, family and friends recommendations for etc. Therefore, it is not the case that minorities need to fight with imaginary spiritual wellness service corporations that exist on like government's world without any explanation. We don't see why giving minorities a desirable and viable source of income is necessarily something that we should regret, given that many minorities still face structural barriers in finding traditional jobs and being employed in sectors where the majority has already staked their presence in, especially when you fall within further intersections of oppression. For example, being a Latina woman in America. When you affirm their right to share their culture and profit off of it in ways that they seem fit, you empower these minorities to create an industry that is inherently, innately, and wholly belonging to their own culture, a sector of industry that they can spearhead and be proud of. Before I move on, I'll take your POI.
So even if it's small businesses or minorities, them being able to use narratives like, oh, this natural retreat will solve all your problems, means that eventually some people who don't have access towards all these things feel like their coping mechanism is inadequate and illegitimate. Why do you think, if you support mental health, do you think it's fair to subject these people to these forms of mental harm so you feel like you're not using the best spiritual wellness available?
Okay, thank you for your POI. I think a very simple response to this is that people are logical, people have brains, and they can think for themselves about whether going for mental retreat, spiritual wellness retreats is something that they need to be shamed into doing. I think people, right, false advertising is another thing that we have brought into this debate without providing any counterfactual on how you do it better. False advertising laws exist. This also applies to SMEs. I don't see how minorities are suddenly exempt from being held liable for the sort of things that they advertise for. For example, I can't tell blatant lies on my advertising, even if I'm a minority, because this goes against certain laws that are written in state legislature. We don't see why minorities are immune to this. We see that they will still be held to the same standards. And even if they want to say they want to guilt trip people into buying into their extended, they want people to continuously get their service for them, it's likely that these people are going to be weeded out by the general checks and balances that they have, because they are, due to commercialization, there are a lot of other alternatives for consumers to see. All right, on to my third substantive about cultural exchange and identity. Realize that minorities have been historically shamed for their participation in state spiritual wellness practices because they are seen as foreign, strange, and weird. For example, their culture and practices are seen as spooky and occultish, and as this is extremely damaging to the identity of minorities insofar as they are told to continuously hide their identities and aspects of them that make them feel proud and unique. Realize that the majority cultures have little incentive to interact with these cultures and gain understanding of these individuals insofar as it never penetrates the mainstream culture. It's seen as spooky, and the outreach of these practices is also very limited insofar as minorities have little capital. So when the commercialization occurs, it is good for these minorities and it's good for their cultures, because providers of the service now have the capital to expand their practices and help it expand into the mainstream market. And the marketing of spiritual wellness campaigns as limited, desirable services that can help you achieve mental and physical wellness allows them to become more cool and hip among mainstream individuals. The normalization of these cultures and cultural practices occur. These allow these practices to become more prevalent and visible in society today. And this combats stereotypes that minority culture is unimportant and shady, etc. If people can more easily buy into these practices and these consumers truly benefit from them or have good experiences with them, they are less likely to perpetuate negative stereotypes about indigenous culture or continue thinking that their culture is a sham. And hence, for all those reasons, we feel we actually benefit these minorities and these minority cultures more. We feel we also allow the majority culture to benefit from the range of benefits that spiritual wellness practices have. For all those reasons, never been brought to oppose. Thank you.
Thank you for the wonderful speech. Now to continue the case of proposition with here.
Hi, am I audible?
Yep, you are.
Okay, I'll be starting my speech. Give me a moment. I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. This debate is not about whether or not these practices are good or bad. This debate is about accessibility, and this debate is about public perception. This debate is not about things like cultural exchange, because cultural exchange can only happen in debate land and not in reality. But before that, I'll provide you two clash in which I'll integrate my rebuttals into that. First is the public perception of spiritual wellness practices. We tell you that such practices are supposed to act as a spiritual self-help kind of thing and not seen as an alternative to mainstream mental health practices like therapy or mental health counseling or talking to your parents, for example. But the way in which corporations and companies market it is relatively predatory and unethical, marketing it as an end-all solution for various mental health problems and preying on the many mental and emotional insecurities of individuals to make them buy more and more. This is bad because the way in which people perceive or view spiritual practice as a viable alternative to more mainstream mental health practices, and this is bad because not only do you misrepresent the way in which indigenous communities want to portray spiritual wellness practices, but also when people feel as though these practices do not actually help alleviate their mental issues and have people calling them out, it only paints an even more negative portrayal of such practices, and this is bad. And this is also worse, particularly for native and indigenous communities, when their practices are viewed in such a negative light, not because of their own doing, by the way, but rather this is how corporations and companies market and misrepresent such practices in order to get a return on sale. This applies to both SMEs and corporations. That is to say that even if we were arguing on SMEs, this harm is still there and they have to deal with it. They have not engaged with their case at all. Then there's and the fact that it's also unprincipled because these companies did not even consent to being represented in this way to begin with. But what the opposition tell you here, right? They told you that corporations don't have incentive to steal such practices, but that's not the case, right? The main reason as to why commercialization exists and at this scale and why this motion is being debated is legit because corporations and companies think it's something there's potential profitability. That is to say, the corporations do not care about the authenticity of the product insofar as people on the ground barely give a crap about authenticity, but also because the way in which companies can market it as being authentic, even when it's not, right? Because they have the financial capital of doing so. So these two are billboards misrepresenting and bastardizing native and indigenous cultures, attaching negative and bad stereotypes about native communities. They say that you learn about the culture. But since when do people give a crap about the culture? I don't go to a Western restaurant seeing char kway teow there and bash into the staff room and yelling, where is the Chinese cook? Because it takes too much time and effort. Same with healing Christians and nature rituals. I don't bash into the door of some company or some corporation and yell, where is the indigenous community there? Who is making this? This means that arguments about cultural exchange just does not materialize when you're locked up for the market by corporations and when corporations misrepresent and bastardize your culture. They don't care. People on the ground do not care because they do not want to have to research about your culture. They don't care about these things because when corporations market it as authentic, people on the ground also likely to buy as authentic. Second clash on this debate is about the accessibility of these practices, right? We tell you that it's comparatively more accessible when corporations and companies don't hike up the products and advertising it as something that's valuable and rare to hike up the price. That is to say that you don't get outreach or increased accessibility or having more people having spiritual clarity when the demand is hyped up by corporations and people buying into that hype, which leads to the price increasing when corporations market such practice as being authentic and by the principle of scarcity. This means that the argument about more competition is not going to materialize insofar as corporations with like large financial capital are able to tap into the market and overshadow SMEs product and native product through mass media by more airtime and also the mass exposure to a wider range of audience through mainstream media. Umar literally told you that corporations will restrict the market of native communities to siphon off more profit because there's a profit incentive to do so. That is to say that when the market is commercialized, it's going to be comparatively worse, but assuming worst case scenario where such practices are not accessible, we are willing to trade that off if it means that we don't bastardize and misrepresent the value and initial message of such practices. We aren't debating on whether or not these practices are good or bad for mental health clarity or mental health or like a spiritual self-help kind of thing. The problem you have to deal with when you commercialize it is how predatory and how unethical the marketing and of corporations and companies would be with regards to the perception of scarcity and the alleged authenticity in such product. Some opposition said that you can have advertising law to regulate the portrayal of such practices. How do you regulate authenticity? You can't just regulate authenticity because authenticity is something that's inherently subjective, but also because most of the time these corporations also have financial capital in order to misrepresent these cultures as being something that's inauthentic. But also about how they raise awareness about mental health. We tell you that just because you are more aware about mental health does not translate into commercialization than being something good to begin with. This is because you are now locked into the advertisement and marketing of predatory corporations. You buy more and more because that's how corporations generate more revenue and return through the inaccurate portrayal of such product. It's comparatively better when people opt into both wellness and mental health practices where there are no narrative or marketing associating spiritual and mental health together. You destroy the financial stability of individuals on the ground on the side of opposition when they continuously buy such products and practices in the hope that they can somehow get better because this is how they're marketed towards the common man. But before that, is there any POI? Okay, no. But now, moving on as to why this is particularly bad for native communities in particular. Because when you see billboards that are misrepresenting the values and the cultures of these communities and misrepresenting the initial product and the initial message of these spiritual self-help practices, people view it as some sort of like viable alternative towards actual mental health therapy session or talking to your family. That is to say, when people on the ground feel as though these products are not actually working, who are they going to call out? They're not going to call a corporation. They'll call out these products. They're going to call out how these products do not actually help them elevate their mental health clarity or whatever, because the bad thing about that is that now people on the ground associate these negative terminologies and associate these associate these sort of negative characteristics with these sorts of practices, even though that's not how they're supposed to be portrayed. This means on the side of opposition, they don't get to control how the narrative or how the marketing is going to look like. We tell you that it's more likely that it's going to be predatory because it's the only way in which the corporations are able to get more profit. They're able to market it through mass media. They have more power, they have more social capital, they have more buying, and they are able to propagate that sort of narrative throughout a lot of people. A lot of people are more likely to buy into it as authentic, buy into it as scarce, and they're willing to pay high prices in order to get access to these sorts of things. That is to say, not only do you lock out poor people that do not have the ability to buy into these sorts of things as a sort of like spiritual health clarity, because now the main market is not going to be people on the ground, but rather the rich and elites that also buy into these sorts of things. But also, secondly, you also lock out indigenous businesses, right? Because when corporations keep telling you or keep advertising to you that A is better than B and B is a native product, that is to say, more people are likely to buy into corporations because people just believe corporations more, and because they have more propagation and more exposure to the people in general. That is to say that native business don't actually thrive. In fact, they only thrive on the outside of the house when it's something that's actually accessible, when the actual culture and the actual messages of these practices are actually being valued, are actually being practices. On the side opposition, they have to contend with the fact that none of their benefits actually exist, right? Cultural exchange do not exist. People do not give a crap about the culture of these sorts of things. And secondly, they don't get to control the sort of narrative and the sort of ideas that you're able to have with regards to spiritual, mental health practices. And because of those reasons, I'm very proud of the proposal. Thank you.
Thank you for that wonderful speech. Now to proceed with this debate, third opposition speaker. Here.
Hi, am I audible?
Yep, you are.
Oh, okay, amazing. POIs verbally. Let me set up my timer. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Oh, sorry. I couldn't start my timer. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. When DPM and GovWIC comes up to tell you that spiritual wellness practices are good, and GovWIC comes up to tell you that the point of the debate is about accessibility, the point of the debate is about improving mental health and benefiting minorities, OPWIC completely agrees. The point of the debate is about accessibility to spiritual wellness practices. The point of the debate is about improving mental health and benefiting minorities. But the fact that government never tells us how the non-commercialization of spiritual wellness practices that effectively locks out communities from even accessing these spiritual wellness practices that they themselves claim are good doesn't show why they win on any of the metrics that they present to the House today. I'll be going through 3 clashes for the House today. Firstly, which side increases access to spiritual wellness programs? Secondly, which side benefits mental health? And lastly, which side benefits minorities the most? On the first clash of which side increases access to spiritual wellness programs, I think government generally created this giant boogeyman of corporations that sell crystals and sell yoga classes like at a mass production scale, and therefore everybody subscribes to these mass crystal producing companies and these mass yoga classes. Recognize that we've already given you like many responses down the bench. Recognize that like spiritual wellness programs are not the same products like burgers, or not the same products are like clothes or like Victoria's Secret or Yankee Candle that Umar wants to talk about, right? Recognize that it's about like the entire business rests upon the personalization and the connection to a culture that is not yours. So essentially what this looks like is, for example, I want to buy a crystal. I need to go to a personalized crystal reading. If I want to go to a nature program or nature ritual, I necessarily need to tell them about myself, and I necessarily need to communicate with the people who are going to provide these services. These are highly personalized, highly intensive. We don't see why corporations have any incentive to tap into this market. Secondly, because it's just too much of it. It's just very low profit margin. Recognize that corporations already have a large amount of large amount of services that they can already create large profit margins on. And we have no idea why McDonald's, who have been making burgers for billions of years, are suddenly going to be incentivized to start providing yoga classes at the same time. So they've never proven to us why exactly corporations are going to be ones dominating the market. Why are minorities and people who actually belong to these cultures are going to be dominating the market for spiritual wellness programs? The answer is very simple. The answer also came out in government whip. Government whip tells you that people don't give a shit about crystals, and therefore people don't give a shit about crystals, and people don't give a shit about yoga and stuff like that. Recognize that these spiritual wellness programs are not targeting people like government whip. The people that these like spiritual wellness programs are actually targeting are people who are already interested in crystals, are already interested in yoga, who are already interested in the spiritual aspect in spiritual wellness in their lives. So obviously they are going to be more invested in finding out about how these things are actually going to benefit them. You know how a crystal reading works. Essentially, right, a crystal reading works insofar as you are able to understand what the crystal does for you. And for you to be able to sell that kind of program, you need to have a large amount of prerequisite knowledge about the culture. You need to have a large amount of a lot of background knowledge about the culture in order to most effectively administer these kinds of spiritual wellness programs. Therefore, the people who are most equipped to even understand these programs and able to administer them the best are therefore the minorities who have the most legitimacy in this market today. I think this is further compounded by the fact that the commercialization of like spiritual wellness programs necessarily means that there's a lot of competition. So like moving aside about the fact that corporations literally, like crystal corporations literally do not exist, like recognize that minorities and small business owners have been dominating this like industry for like insofar as it's been rising, insofar as that like the digital age has allowed a large amount of minorities to start up like crystal businesses and like free like tarot readings at little to no startup cost with the advent of social media and the advent of like digitalization. I think even if we take their best case on the idea that corporations will exist and corporations will try to like sell crystals at really expensive prices, recognize that this already kind of exists in status quo insofar as you can sell jewelry for really high prices anyway. Recognize that these kinds of things are going to exist in either sides of the house, such as luxury goods. We don't see why this is a bad thing. Secondly, moving on to which side benefits mental health. I think government has come up with two reasons as to why opposition will have shitty mental health. The first reason being that consumerism will make people feel bad, and the second reason being that people don't want to go to therapy now. Okay, let's just say consumerism makes people feel bad. Okay, even if the commercialization of crystals and like yoga will make people feel bad, recognize that this is symmetrical on both sides of the house insofar as you just have a large number of products like in the entire capitalist culture in status quo on both sides of the house today. People are still going to feel bad when they come back engagement rings for their partners anyway, and like there's just like 6 billion other items that can make people feel bad via consumerism. Neither side of the house solves consumerism, so we just think this is a wash. Secondly, about how people are not wanting to go to therapy now because it is now seen as a legitimate alternative to things like going to therapy. I think recognize that they're just extremely unnuanced about status quo in general because they can't even give us examples. And second, let's just recognize that people already don't want to go to therapy because A, therapy is very expensive, even more so than buying a $20 crystal, and B, therapy has a social stigma against it insofar as it's seen as an extremely like serious practice to undergo insofar as it's been medicalized, it's been lauded in society as something you need to go to if you're truly fucked up in the head. Recognize that crystals and yoga serve as an alternative to prove that you're not actually like screwed up in the head, but can still access self-help and can still access self-help and self-care anyway. Recognize that people already don't want to go to therapy on either sides of the house. We just think that other forms of self-care should be made available via commercialization, via normalization of these other forms of alternative spiritual wellness practices. I think if you want to tell me about how the lack of like spiritual wellness programs will suddenly make people want to go to therapy, fine, but they just never prove to us why this occurs. I think furthermore, the idea that you access communities that actually care about spiritual wellness and mental wellness, like insofar as you go to like maybe a yoga class, maybe if other people are really invested in keeping a clear mind, in being able to like think through things like logically, these are the kinds of people that are also more likely to be invested in ideas like mental health and the ideas of like mental stability. This is more likely for you to encourage you to go to try out like other kinds of practices that also allow you to achieve the mental clarity that the people in your community also want to get. So recognize that even if people don't want to go to therapy, recognize that if we providing the environment where it's safe to talk about mental health, where it's safe to care about your mental wellness via like yoga classes or via like nature retreats. We think that government just never tells us how like people will want to go to therapy at the point at which like spiritual wellness services do not exist. I don't think that like if I don't have a crystal suddenly I want to talk to my parents. If I don't have a crystal suddenly I want to go to therapy. Just never proves fine. Lastly, about which benefits my minorities the most. government says two things about how we don't benefit minorities. The first reason why it won't benefit minorities is because minorities will feel sad and like cannot control the narrative when spiritual wellness practices are misrepresented. People will think really bad things about yoga when corporations are saying that yoga is the best thing in the world. Look, do I need to repeat the statement again? Recognize that if corporations say that yoga is the best thing in the world, oftentimes what this means is that people have a good impression of yoga and a good impression of the people who practice it. So we don't see how like any form of like negative stereotype is going to be perpetuated either. Like the mental gymnastics to go through that is just too much to bear. I think secondly, even if there's some form of like misrepresentation of the worst case and saying that yoga is bad, although I don't know why you want to say that to market your yoga, I think recognize that insofar as minorities can still earn money from these like practices of like selling crystals and like selling yoga, it's like the kind of like lifeblood that minorities need to survive. Insofar as minorities are already systemically oppressed and like repressed from like any form of like corporate structure that they can achieve anyway. So we think that selling crystals on Carousel and selling crystals on Etsy is still like a perfectly legitimate way for them to earn money. We think that's how we benefit minorities. That's why it's never engaged. Therefore, for all these reasons, please set aside opposition. Thank you.
For that wonderful speech. Now to start with the reply speeches, opposition reply.
Hi, am I audible?
Yep, go on.
Okay, give me a second to set up my camera. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, what does that government say that spiritual wellness services look like? They say Yankee Candle and Victoria's Secret. They say blueberry candle and strawberry candle. They say strawberry buffon. The very fact of that tells you that they have no idea what this debate is actually about. Throughout the entire opposition bench, we have repeatedly pressed them to abide by their DPM's very own reminder that this is a retrospective debate and look at the status quo, to give us an example of a spiritual wellness corporation that is not Victoria's Secret. What do we get out of them? They continue to run a parallel case without engaging, sticking to their characterization, even though they don't want to take the trade-off of giving us an actual example so that we can claim their characterization as legitimate. And given the fact that they have never given us any concrete example of a corporation that sells yoga, that sells crystals, that sells nature retreats, I don't see how they win on characterization. Let's take a look at what side government has given us throughout their entire bench. On the point of minorities, what did government tell you? They tell you that they are being exploited by a big boogeyman corporation insofar as their culture becomes superficial. We have already responded to this since my first speaker, and it's been continually ignored down the entire government bench, and like they just continuously refuse to engage on our rebuttal. We have already told you that the nature of spiritual wellness practices is not like selling burgers, it's not like selling clothes, it's not like selling jewelry. It's not something that corporations can easily mimic, because spiritual wellness practices are innately like and inherently personal and customized in nature. You can't just have a corporation like just hire like a lot of people to give like one-on-one consultations. It's not something that like has a very like big profit margin. It's not something that corporations will look into, especially since corporations are profit driven and they only want to indulge in endeavors that are guaranteed to earn them a lot of money. Additionally, right, we tell you that SMEs and small corporations, like small businesses, are still going to be seen as more legitimate in the eyes of consumers who consume these practices, insofar as most of the people, like most of the small businesses providing these services, are people who originate from the culture themselves. I've given you the example of like Chinese cook, like give you Chinese food. It is simply like a very intuitive point. I don't understand why side government just cannot understand this. It's simply the fact that you as a person who originates from the culture, like knows the most about it and is the most qualified to give services regarding like aspects of your culture. I don't see why consumers cannot like do simple cost benefit analysis. I don't see why they cannot do simple comparatives like and like choose one that is like most authentic and like most likely to reap like plausible benefit for them. So everything that they have told you about minorities is like completely, you are not helping them at all on your side. So on the point of coercive choice, we tell you advertising laws exist.
especially for products like crystals, which have not been medically or scientifically proven to cure COVID or cancer. If a seller claims that these sorts of benefits will accrue, they are also held liable by false advertising legislature, even if it's not a claim to cure COVID, but rather sellers who pressurize consumers into continually buying crystals. Because if you don't buy crystals, your life will go to shit and like everything will just go downhill for you. We tell you that these predatory sellers will occur on both sides of the house. But on your side, it's worse at the point in which you don't have commercialization. There are little to no alternatives for people to turn to because the industry is so small and not mainstream. If sellers are coercive and evil on our side, at least there exists a mainstream industry which makes alternatives more accessible so that people can go find other avenues to gain their practices instead of sticking with that evil, mean, coercive seller that you love to talk about on government bench. Thirdly, they talk about the therapy point. We've already told you that crystals are not marketed as like this thing that can solve all your problems. And even if like that is the case, right? We have said in your LO that you also enter communities who care about your mental health or spiritual health, and they can act as a check and balance by letting you know that crystals are not like the end all, like the be all and all. You also need to take other steps to complement your journey on like having better mental health. And I think for all those reasons, we have already told you why side government just doesn't know what they're talking about. They are not adhering to the motion. They are totally unresponsive. Hence, for all those reasons, never been brought to oppose. Thank you.
For reply, not to formally end this debate. Proposition reply.
Three, 2, 1. So behind me is an example of a crystal company because opposition wants it that much. But I also just want to point out that even if we weren't able to create the concrete examples they wanted to show, it was unclear why the uncharitable characterization from their side, the market right now was perfect, was able to win them a debate with regards to all the characterizations we proved to you earlier. The first thing to talk about here is where is this an inherent good or bad? Because irregardless of whether you believe mental health to be good or bad thing, because I mean, obviously solving mental health is a good or bad thing, what they had to prove was objectively why people being able to use the narrative that this form of like coping mechanism towards mental health, that spiritual wellness that must come in the form of nature retreats, that must come in the form of meditative retreats are going to be the only way to solve these problems. If their side agrees that individualizing the experience was important, it's obviously not possible on their side because they have to defend painting the commercialized narrative that using a yoga retreat was objectively the best way in order to solve your coping mechanisms. There was zero response down the bench, the very clear characterization that both sides obviously want to solve mental health. The problem was that they constrained that narrative to only saying that a few options are legitimate, and those tend to be the most exclusionary and highly priced things, which leads to the second point here. Was this going to be accessible in the first place? Because the most vulnerable individuals who need these products the most are not going to be the ones who are going to get access towards it. Because I don't care if it's personalized towards you. I don't care if it's in theory a good concept. If many people aren't able to afford it in the first place, then our analysis comes analytically prior and upstream to theirs, because then they aren't able to lead towards the benefits they wanted to claim. We told you that producers of these wellness experiences do not have incentives to lower prices. I identified 4 structural reasons for why prices were going to be high, which received very little response from their side. Their only mechanisms for this was that, well, we have SMEs and minority businesses doing this. Regardless of whoever is doing this, the very fact that they're able to push out emotional narratives that seek to constrain your ability to make choices consensually means that using narratives such as this healing crystal is the best wellness and all other alternatives in the market means that people who don't get access towards the most superior alternative or like the supposedly superior wellness aren't going to feel the best about themselves. Because no matter how many meditation retreats that you take, if you aren't able to get access towards the best options available, you always feel like you're using an illegitimate mechanism. Secondly, about good experiences. Their response towards all the ideas about advertisements was like, we can have regulation. So the problem was not false advertising, it was legal advertising, but it was coercive and preyed upon your emotional sentiments. Their response was like consumerism makes people feel bad. Like, yes, but the debate is about comparative and scale. When it comes to something as vital as coping mechanisms for your mental health, we want people to feel that their mechanism is legitimate rather than having to succumb towards the coercive narratives that exist in society that say this is objectively the best way to do it. Because if you feel that you aren't creating the most adequate mechanism available to you, then you're likely to have, no matter how many like crystals you have, you aren't going to feel good about this. The final thing here about minorities, which obviously their side has a skewed picture on, because they say that like minorities are able to to profit off this. The first thing to point out was we gave you multiple reasons why it probably isn't going to the minorities themselves that are selling this as well, because it was likely to be true that they don't have the enough capital for this. It can't be true that it's small businesses, because many small businesses don't own ponds, don't own natural sites that they're able to make people go to and within their own territory. So it probably can't be the small businesses anyway. But even on the best case of their side about minorities being able to profit off this, it still doesn't directly respond to the analysis for how it's going to hurt the most amount of people. They don't prove why it's the best alternative for minorities and exclusively the only way minorities were able to profit off this, because we gave you multiple reasons why minorities can't profit off this, but why it oftentimes leads towards you stealing and like robbing people, like indigenous people, of the ability for their own culture, because they have to depend on other entities that are better able to commercialize this. The final thing to point out here was that even in the absolute best case of their side, and to be extremely charitable, this wasn't going to be a mechanism for them forever. We gave you reasons to why the commercialization means that both within the product itself and also like the marketing strategies means that people feel like they're dependent upon this, because the hedonistic treadmill means they always have to use these things, means that they aren't going to actually seek mental health alternatives that were better for them. If they believed that people cared about wellness products, they obviously also cared about mental health, because that was the only way they were opting in towards the products in the first place. So on either side, they'll be able to cater towards their mental health. So on their side, it was a disastrous opportunity that was going to like just destroy them. So like, yeah, proud to propose.
All right, thank you for the wonderful debate. You may now cross the house. Also, we'll just announce the results later, so good luck.